we now turn our attention to West Africa. Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria, has around 150 million people. It has installed power generation capacity of around 6,000 megawatts. However, the entire system has in recent years struggled to produce up to half its capacity. Low water levels in the hydro stations at times coexist with the gas disruptions in the Niger Delta, creating blackouts in most parts of the country. Ivory Coast produces around 2,000 megawatts for its 22 million people. It relies mainly on natural gas-powered stations and hydroelectric plants. Ivorians also use individual fuel-powered generators in most parts of the country, as is the case in most of the West African countries. In Ghana, 60% of the 24 million people are said to have electricity. Like most in the region, Ghana depends on hydropower for its electricity. Ghana plans to increase its capacity by 2,000 megawatts. Ghana's national power demand presently stands at 1,500 megawatts. Joining us now from our Lagos bureau is Kola Karim, the CEO of Shoreline Energy International. Hello, and one of you, just to start off with, give us a quick sketch of the power scene in West Africa.
Thank you, Chris. What is happening today in West Africa is very simple. Governments have realized the funding required to drive this infrastructure in the power sector cannot be funded by themselves alone. So what they've done is creating enabling environments for private sector investment and participation in helping to increase capacity in these areas.
And where are the big opportunities in West Africa for power and investment right now?
Nigeria, of course. One, by virtue of numbers, the presentation just gave you 150 million people. You've got power generation of 6,000, of which today I think we're hovering around 4,000 megawatts. If you compare it to South Africa, looking at your population vis-a-vis the power generation as it stands, and you're short of power are 40,000. Then you see where the huge opportunity lies in a growing market like Nigeria with its infrastructure and its numbers and people.
Now, Nigeria has been liberalizing its power system to try to get more investment. How is that going down with investors?
I think it's been very good. What has happened today is the Bureau of Public Enterprise has gone on a roadshow trying to showcase what is on offer from government, i.e. the 11 power distribution companies the government is trying to privatize, also the generation companies that they're putting out there. The interest, it's been huge, but one thing is important. I think the reality is going to be how many of these global corporates actually make that dive to come into Nigeria to actually do it.
How many do you think? I mean, what's the likelihood?
I think, promising from a lot of the discussions we've had, there is interest. The problem has always been that fear factor of the unknown when it comes to Nigeria. But reality is, for local operators like us, it gives the opportunity and potentials because we know the market, we understand the market, and we're investing in the region. So the importance for us is whatever happens, there will be a play in this sector if government is sincere and focused in making it happen.
And just finally, I mean, what do you think is the greatest problem that Africa has to overcome to get the power that it needs?
I think it's reliability from government to the investor, in making them have that comfortable feel that if I put my money in your country, I will get adequate return and also secure my investment. Also, and more importantly, have the adequate framework to safeguard that investment in that polity environment.
Thank you very much, Kola Karim, the CEO of Shoreline, there from our Lagos bureau. Coming back to the studio to you, gentlemen, I saw you exchanging knowing looks there when he said, are big corporates going to make the dive into creating African power? What do you think, Chris?
I think Kola is spot on. I have limited expectations of government, not just our government in South Africa, but all governments, and the ability to provide electricity in an increasingly complex world. They don't have the flexibility or the aptitude to get involved in these things. And I think the answer is liberalization. The answer is to let government concentrate on a few things and let them get it right. And that means the enabling environment, the regulatory environment, the infrastructure, or some of the infrastructure environments that will encourage investment. This is something they can do and should do, and they should concentrate on doing that and doing it well, and letting the private sector do what it does well, that is take risks, calculated risks, knowing what the returns will be. And I think the scenario described by Kohler is spot on, and I wish them every success.
Brian, what do you think?
Well, I think he was spot on. But the other point he made, which is very, very important, is the investors are going to want to know that their investment is secure, that they're going to get the returns that they're expecting, and that's where the government has to come in and provide the stability. And that's what is also a critical issue in the African context, is you want to know that these are long-term investments. They're 20 years plus investments that the one's making. You want to know that that is going to live past changes of government. You don't want to run the risk that every time there's a new government comes in place, which is potentially every 4 or 5 years, that the whole investment environment is going to be turned on its head again, because that's a disaster for you. The one point he also made was, and it's very important, it builds to what Chris said earlier here, invest in power generation, but you've got to plug it into a distribution network which is firm and secure and reliable in order to actually be able to get that power to the customer who's going to pay. That's the critical issue.
Okay, Brian, hold it there. We're going to East Africa now in our Nairobi bureau. We're now joined by Statham Mutimba, the Africa MD of CAMCO. But before we get into this debate, let's first set the scene. Kenya, with its hydroelectricity, is the biggest power producer in East Africa. It generates 1,300 megawatts for around 39 million people. But dry weather has cut production, and power cuts have cost the country's food and flour industries dearly. Last year, Kenya secured a $330 million loan to expand its power output, especially in geothermal power. Just over the border in Uganda, people also lean heavily on hydropower for their 591 megawatts. Power output has doubled over the last 5 years to keep pace with a fast-growing economy, and again drought has cut capacity. In Tanzania, only 3/4 of the population share the country's 830 megawatts. There are plans to connect more than 8,000 villages to the national grid. This would likely strain the power supply even more, but there are plans to draw more power from Zambia and Uganda. In Rwanda, only 6 out of 100 people are connected to the mere 75 megawatts generated. The country, still rebuilding following the genocide, is also looking at methane gas from the depths of the massive Lake Kivu on its northwestern border. Now we're going now to Statham Mutimba, the Africa MD of CAMCO in our Nairobi bureau. Just to start off with, Stephen, can you just give us a quick sketch of East Africa and its power issues?
Thank you very much. In East Africa, most of the countries use hydroelectricity, which is the dominant, we can call it renewable energy. The other energy that is used for cooking and heating is mostly biomass, which is firewood and charcoal. And you'll find that 90% of the entire population, especially the rural people, they use biomass and charcoal.
Now you've got a story going on up there, Stephen. You've got interest in geothermal, you've got wind energy coming up in Tanzania and Kenya. I mean, how is the in-market burgeoning up there?
Geothermal is actually one of the renewable energies that the governments of East Africa, especially Tanzania and Kenya, have focused on. And the Geothermal Development Company, which was registered a few years back by the government, has made a lot of strides in developing geothermal power. There are plans to develop over 500 megawatts of geothermal in the next, let's say, 3 to 4 years. And we've seen that in the newspapers in the last 2 weeks, they've been advertising for investors who may want to be part of the development of geothermal in Kenya. So that is going on. Same to Tanzania, we see that there's a lot of interest in exploring and drilling boreholes for getting geothermal. So it's one of the most promising renewable energy we have in the East Africa region.
So how likely is it that there will be a massive investment over the next few years in East Africa, bearing in mind the demand for power?
We've seen the opening up. Uganda so far has the best feed-in tariff. It's one that has seen a lot of investors go to Uganda. Kenya is also revising its renewable energy feed-in tariff, and they have formed a green energy initiative, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. And we're seeing a lot of companies, especially in the wind area. There's Lake Turkana Wind Power, which is investing over $400 million from some Dutch investors. So I think as far as wind and cogeneration, especially from sugar industry is concerned, we're seeing quite a lot of development from the private sector.
Thank you very much, Stephen Mutimba there from our Nairobi bureau. So wrapping up there, East Africa.
Yeah, I think the message is coming through loud and clear from West Africa, from East Africa, and from South Africa, that the critical issue for investment is policy stability and the right regulatory environment and the right investment environment, and this is key. Just look at some of the opportunities and one sees very low levels of electrification throughout sub-Saharan Africa. We saw in Tanzania, we saw in Kenya, and a number of countries around the continent, the level of access to electricity is very low. But we need to be very careful. This is a nice opportunity and it sounds nice. But unless there is productive use of electricity, this consumptive use of electricity by just electrifying domestic users is not the answer. If we only electrify villages and domestic users, we are increasing the poverty of the continent by increasing consumptive spending. We need to, at the same time, make sure that there is productive enterprises and productive demand for electricity, industry in other words, productive industry, getting away from importing everything from overseas, local manufacture and productive use of electricity. If we don't get that right, no amount of electrification of domestic users is going to result in a sustainable solution.
And lastly, very briefly, Brian, just wrap up.
Well, I think Chris is half there, but I think you've got to make another investment. And the investment is in getting education right as well. That's fundamental. And if we don't electrify and start lifting the quality of life of these people, there are almost 800 million people across the African continent who don't have access to commercial forms of energy. We've got to give those people some basic energy rights to get educated and to start interacting in the commercial sector, and only then will we achieve the sustainable solutions that we need.
I agree with you, Brian, but it's not enough to just electrify 800 million people.
It's not enough.
One's got to do more.